Well, the big news out of COP28, of course, was the long anticipated and long awaited agreement to set up a loss and damage fund. These occasions, these gatherings have helped to elevate Africa's voice in the global debate around climate change and climate action. The reality, of course, is that Africa is home to tremendous potential, and the focus was very much on highlighting that and communicating not just across Africa, but to the world, that this is a continent that is not just a victim of climate change. It is a very important part of the solution. My name is Lanre Akinola. I'm the head of content at the Norwegian African Business Association and an Africa Climate Ambassador 2023. I'm the head of content at the Norwegian African Business Association. Our mission, our job, our work is all about strengthening relations between Norway and the wider Nordic region and African economies. Our focus is very much on driving mutually beneficial investment. And this dovetails nicely with being a climate ambassador because from a Norwegian perspective, sustainability, climate finance, green growth and sustainable investing are key priorities, and there are huge opportunities for engagement there. So it's a good fit. The first Africa Climate Summit, it's important to say, there are many ways you can look at this. My big takeaway from the ACS 2023 is that for the first time, we saw Africa come together in a coordinated, confident manner to address the question of how do we respond to this challenge of climate change and climate action? And the key takeaway is that the narrative was very much in focus in Nairobi. The narrative around Africa is often that the continent cannot and will not be able to muster the resources to meaningfully address climate change. The reality, of course, is that Africa is home to tremendous potential, and the focus was very much on highlighting that and communicating not just across Africa, but to the world, that this is a continent that is not just a victim of climate change. It is a very important part of the solution, and that is a big step from where we have been in the past. So COP is short for the Conference of the Parties. In essence, this is the single biggest global gathering of world leaders, which takes place annually, the objective of which is to come up with a coordinated international response to climate change. It's been going for 30 odd years now, so it's been around for a while. It is the main focal point internationally. It brings together governments from across the world, and increasingly now we're seeing it's also bringing together more and more stakeholders across the public and private sectors. So it's a very important pillar of the international effort to formulate a coordinated strategy to tackle climate change. One is the message. The message is that Africa is not just a victim. Africa has tremendous potential, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's the potential for food production, whether it's potential for critical minerals. Many of the solutions that the world needs, many of the resources that the world needs to effectively tackle climate change are on the African continent. So that's one big takeaway, the message. It's like we are not just victims, we are also actors, and we are ready to work with you to harness some of this potential. Other key messages were particularly around financing. Many African governments find themselves at the moment in difficult fiscal positions, which has compounded the difficulty around being able to mobilize the resources, particularly financing, to invest in adaptation, mitigation, and the bigger picture of developing a more sustainable approach to development. And within that, an important message that came out of Nairobi was an appeal to the international community to say that the global financial architecture, as it currently stands, is incompatible with the needs of African economies when it comes to the climate change fight, and that there is an urgent need to rework the global financial architecture to address things like debt sustainability on the continent, limited fiscal space, and of course, the need for much more private investment and private capital to go into the climate change and climate action space. Well, the big news out of COP28, of course, was the long anticipated and long awaited agreement to set up a loss and damage fund, which in short basically provides funding for low income countries facing unavoidable economic losses due to climate change. This took many years of negotiation, and it's important recognition that there is a need to step up financial support for countries that, regardless of what they are currently doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change, face unavoidable economic losses. So that's the good news. The challenge, of course, is that the actual sort of meat on the bones, if you wish, with the loss and damage fund leaves a lot to be desired. My understanding is that the commitments so far are something in the region of 790 million US dollars. And anyone who pays any attention to the financing needs that not just Africa has, but the world has, will immediately recognize that this is nowhere near enough to meaningfully tackle the big picture challenge of climate change. However, that said, it is also reflective of how the global narrative around climate change is shifting. Because the reason we now have a loss and damage fund is because the so-called, and I use this term reluctantly, the so-called developing world over the last 30 years has become a much more important part of the global economy, and that voice is increasingly coming through in platforms like COP28. So I think overall, big picture, very important step. But of course, when we look at the details, there's still a lot of work to do. The simple answer is yes, in the sense that it has these occasions, these gatherings have helped to elevate Africa's voice in the global debate around climate change and climate action. For whatever reasons, and we can, that's a different topic of debate, Africa has historically found itself confined to the margins of many of the important discussions and decisions that shape the global economic and political landscape. What we're seeing now is that the continent is becoming more central to this discussion, and that can only be a good thing. The not necessarily downside, but the reality, of course, is that there's still a lot of work to be done to translate that overall overarching change and shift in narrative around Africa into real results. And there, one of the key issues is financing. And things like financing, that's one key issue, but also the need to develop entirely new approaches, and I would say holistic approaches to how Africa pursues its economic development, factoring in the climate challenge and the need for climate action to build more resilient, sustainable, and green economies. I'm not sure about the sad part. The rest is uncontroversially the case. Africa faces enormous challenges. We all know that, just to kind of, one of the bywords almost for Africa when it comes to climate change is we have contributed the least to historical CO2 emissions, but we also all know that the continent's economies are amongst the most vulnerable globally. So enormous challenges, but also enormous opportunities. What I would say is that this applies to every part of the world. This is a challenge that is global in scope. And there isn't a part of the world that doesn't have both challenges and opportunities. The question isn't about, is there good and bad here? Of course there is. That's a given. And that's just the reality of life, if you want. The question is, what do we do about it? And that really is, I think, where the focus needs to be. We can't just lament where Africa is. We need to focus on where we're going. On the surface, and many people might go down this route, it's the money. There is a massive need for more financing across the board. You take your pick, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's infrastructure development, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, etc. However, I would say that if we zoom out a little bit more and if we really interrogate this, the big challenge is that African economies need to fundamentally re-examine their development model and figure out how you put your economy onto a more sustainable and green footing. Now, the debate around the transition from fossil fuels to green growth will continue for a long time, and we know that there are different perspectives on this. However, if you look around the world and you look at the major economies and the major economic centers, which are also the main contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change. I'm talking, of course, about China, the United States, the European Union, and India, and a few other major economies. It is obvious that a strategic long-term decision has been made at the very highest level that the future of development is sustainability, and green growth. So, regardless of where we are today, whatever, if Africa is to pursue a successful economic development path in this century, it has to be based on how do we move from a fossil fuel, unsustainable model of economic development to a model of development that is inherently sustainable. Of course, it can. The qualifying statement there is it's not going to be easy. It's all possible. We have seen over the last decades tremendous transformation stories in parts of the world. We all know who they are. Countries like South Korea, countries like Taiwan, like China, and more recently places like Vietnam that have been able to go from a situation in which they seem to be hopelessly underdeveloped to completely transforming their societies. It can be done. There is no objective reason why Africa cannot rise to the challenge of climate change to tackle it effectively. However, we have to be absolutely honest and realistic that that is going to require radical changes in policy, a radical step change in implementation of policies, and a coordinated, integrated approach across the continent. So yes, of course, Africa can meet the challenge, but it's not going to be easy. And we have to have an honest conversation about how ready we are to do the work. The financing challenge is one that is very pressing. And here, it's tricky because let's assume for a moment that the loss and damage fund completely delivers. Let's assume for a moment that developed nations, wealthy economies finally deliver on their $100 billion a year pledge to support adaptation and mitigation efforts in developing economies. Let's assume all of that financing tomorrow is available. It will still account for a fraction of the investment that is going to be needed across the globe, including across the African continent in the coming decades. Don't quote me on this, but I've seen figures in the range of Africa needing something like $300 billion a year, which is more than triple what has currently been pledged to the Loss and Damage Fund. And by the end of this decade, the continent will need $2.8 trillion in financing just to keep up with the impact of climate change. So the conclusion from that, of course, is public financing is not going to be enough. We also know that many African governments at the moment are struggling with limited public fiscal space. So they can't, even if they are ready right now to do it, to make those investments, which of course leads us to the issue of, well, where's this money going to come from? The answer, I think, is twofold. One is the private sector. The private sector has a critical role to play here. So African economies, they can't afford to sit and wait for COP28 to run its course, because we will have to sit through many more COPs before the money really starts flowing. In the interim, and this is an important nuance, I think, in this debate, is that it's not just about COP28. It's not just about the Africa Climate Summit. Across the world, the private sector now understands that business as usual is no longer fit for purpose. So focus on that. Look to the private sector and understand what is it going to take in terms of creating the right environment for investment to really catalyze capital, but also look to how you can mobilize domestic resources and financing. Africa, yes, we know that money is always an issue, but there's a lot of underutilized financial potential across the continent. And finally, what I would say is look to your new partners. Let's not forget that all of this is happening against the backdrop of a world that is rapidly changing, and we're seeing the emergence of new economic centers of power, and those are also now increasingly looking towards Africa. The UAE, I think, is a fantastic example where we've already seen huge commitments in terms of supporting climate finance and climate investment on the continent, building resilience. China has the potential to be a huge source of potential investment. So I would say it's a mix of look to the private sector and try to look to some of your new partners. And with all due respect, I would say it's going to be more difficult from the more established partners, in Europe and in North America that we often focus on. The two are essentially, these are essentially two sides of the same coin. You cannot separate the question of climate change from the question of development. Whether it is infrastructure, whether it is your education system, whether it is agriculture, whether it is energy, you name it, all of these aspects that constitute what we call economic development are inherently linked to climate change. So you have to, I just don't see how else you approach this. I wouldn't even call it a nexus. It's just a case of economic development in this century only makes sense if at some point you approach it through the prism of climate change and the need for climate action. Well, this has raised some eyebrows for, I think, a couple of reasons. One of those reasons being that my understanding is that the World Bank is going to take a sort of like a 24 or 25% cut of the funding that is dedicated to the loss and damage fund. So right off the bat, you have a huge chunk of money in a situation where funds are already extremely limited going to the World Bank to administer this fund. And my understanding or my reading of it as well is that there is some that this is also reflective, or the selection of the World Bank to administer it is reflective of the ongoing disagreements between so-called developed and developing economies about who is responsible, who manages this process. And I think that parts of the so-called developing world are a little bit cautious around bringing in what is very much an entrenched, some would say, establishment institution to run this. So we'll have to see how it goes. I'm not suggesting that it's not going to work out, but we need to be vigilant. The loss and damage fund essentially could be described as the third pillar when it comes to climate action. Mitigation and adaptation are well established and now accepted as key priorities. However, the loss and damage fund goes a step beyond that by addressing unavoidable economic losses despite mitigation and adaptation efforts. So it's I think an overdue third pillar globally, and a step in the right direction. We are in a very important moment in history. The fight against climate change is coinciding with tremendous change internationally of how the world is organized economically and politically. Within that, Africa, I think, has a stronger voice than it has ever had, and the potential to be a more influential player in shaping the architecture through which the world is going to tackle climate change than ever before. It's in our hands. It's up to the decisions we make. It's not up to the decisions that are made elsewhere in the world. And that's where you want to be in life. You want to have it in your hands. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy. It's going to be a lot of work. There will be ups and there will be downs. There will be things that are very difficult, but it is up to us. And there's nothing better than that, because all we need to do is make the right decisions, coordinate effectively, drive regional integration, understand the right policies, implement them. And then there's absolutely no reason why we can't only meet this challenge, but show the world how it's done.